Well, at least Kevin can keep the old tools from the basement. He's always been good at fixing broken things. My Uncle Richard's laughter echoed through the lawyer's office as if he had just told the joke of the century. The entire room burst into laughter. Aunt Margaret wiped imaginary tears from her eyes. My cousin Derek almost choked on his coffee. Even Mr. Morrison's secretary, our family lawyer, smiled discreetly. I remained seated in the worn leather chair, hands folded in my lap, watching the spectacle of humiliation as if I were watching a bad movie whose ending I already knew. The black suit I had bought especially for my grandfather's funeral 3 weeks ago seemed to tighten around my neck with every passing second. My name is Kevin Chun, and I am 31 years old. For the past decade, I have woken up every day at 5 in the morning to run Chen & Associates, the engineering and construction company my grandfather founded in 1985 here in Seattle. While Richard spent his weekends on expensive golf courses and Derek posted photos of his travels through Europe on Instagram, I was on construction sites, solving foundation problems, negotiating with suppliers, and ensuring that our projects were delivered on time. But apparently, none of that mattered to the people sitting in that room with dark mahogany walls. Richard always had his business sense, Aunt Margaret commented, adjusting the pearl necklace that probably cost more than our workers' monthly salary. Father knew he was the only one capable of maintaining the family legacy. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood. Richard having business sense. The man who had visited exactly 4 construction sites in his entire life, and on every occasion complained that his Italian shoes were getting dirty. The man who couldn't tell structural concrete from mortar, who thought C80 was a brand of cars and that delivery date was something negotiable. Well, Richard continued, straightening the Hermes tie that matched his gold cufflinks perfectly, I suppose Kevin can continue doing what he's always done. Real businessmen need someone to take care of the paperwork, don't they? Mr. Morrison, an elderly man with completely white hair who had known our family since before I was born, cleared his throat almost imperceptibly. His kind eyes met mine for a moment, and something in that look made my heart race. A spark of something that seemed almost expectant. Actually, Mr. Morrison's calm voice cut through the laughter like a sharp blade. There's a specific clause in the will that I need to read before we proceed. Silence fell over the room so quickly that I could hear the hum of the central air conditioning. Richard's confident smile faltered for a split second, like a television image with interference. And for the first time in 10 years of being treated like the invisible assistant, the family nerd who was only good for doing the dirty work, I felt something hot and dangerous spreading through his chest. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was something more calculated, more controlled. It was the anticipatory satisfaction of someone who knows the game is about to turn. Mr. Morrison opened a separate folder, different from the one he had used to read the initial parts of the will. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the yellowed paper, and for a moment, I almost saw a smile forming at the corners of her mouth. This clause, he began, her voice taking on a more formal tone, was added to the will exactly 6 years ago, with specific instructions that it should only be revealed after the initial reading of the provisions. 6 years ago. My brain processed the information quickly. 6 years ago was when Richard decided to take a sabbatical to find himself at some spiritual retreat in Thailand, while his was managing the largest bid in our company's history. The Riverfront Tower project, $500 million in contracts that we almost lost because investors wanted guarantees that only someone with deep technical knowledge could provide. The clause reads as follows, Mr. Morrison continued, and the silence in the room was so thick it seemed solid. Whereas his grandson Kevin has demonstrated, over the past several years, exceptional commitment to the values and mission of Chen & Associates. I watched Richard's face change expression. His arrogant confidence began to turn into something closer to confusion. And considering that he has taken on operational responsibilities that go far beyond her formal duties. Aunt Margaret stopped fiddling with her necklace. Derek dropped his cell phone. I hereby clarify the true ownership structure of Chen & Associates. My heart was beating so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but inside, every cell in my body was vibrating with anticipation. Mr. Morrison paused dramatically, his eyes scanning every face in the room before finally settling on me. And then, with the clarity of a bell ringing on a quiet morning, he said the words that would change everything. Chen & Associates is no longer registered in Richard Chen's name, as he believes. The transfer of ownership was completed on March 15, 2019. The world seemed to stop. I could see every detail with crystal clarity, the coffee cup trembling in Derek's hand, the way Richard's jaw slowly dropped, the way Aunt Margaret gripped the edge of the table as if the floor were collapsing beneath his feet. What does this mean? Richard's voice came out strangled, all his previous arrogance evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses and pulled out another document, this one much thicker. It means, Mr. Richard Chun, that you never owned the company. His father transferred all of the shares to Kevin 6 years ago. He is, and has been ever since, the sole legal owner of Chen and Associates. If you're enjoying discovering how the arrogance of an entire family is about to crumble, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how far this twist goes. What none of them knew, as they stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to panic, was that this revelation was only the beginning. Because my grandfather hadn't just left me the company. He had left me something far more valuable, the complete truth about what Richard had been doing in the shadows, and the exact tools to bring him to justice. But as I watched my uncle try to process that her entire life of privilege was built on an illusion, I allowed myself only the slightest of smiles. "That's impossible," Richard stammered, his voice losing all of that oily confidence that he always wore. "I am the heir. I have always been the heir." I watched my uncle disintegrate in real time. His hands trembled as he tugged at his tie knot, as if the fabric were suffocating him. Her face, always tanned from her constant trips to the Caribbean, was turning red and blotchy. "Mr. Morrison," Richard's voice took on a desperate tone, "there must be some mistake. My father would never do this. We talked about the future of the company dozens of times." "You talked," the lawyer corrected gently, leafing through a few more documents. His father listened. "As Kevin mentioned, there's a significant difference." Aunt Margaret stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward with a thud. "That's ridiculous. Kevin can barely dress himself properly. How could he run a multi-million-dollar engineering company?" I glanced down at my simple black suit, bought on sale at a department store, and then at Richard's Armani ensemble, which probably cost more than my 3-month salary. The irony was so thick I could almost feel it in the air. "Actually," Mr. Morrison said, pulling out a thick financial report, "under Kevin's management, his Chen and Associates has increased its value by 62%. Annual revenue has gone from $23 million to $37 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek let out a nervous laugh. But Kevin just takes care of the paperwork. Richard does the important business deals." I felt something warm rising in his throat. It wasn't exactly anger. It was something deeper, more visceral. Years of humiliation, of being treated like the failed cousin, the nerd of the family who didn't understand anything about real business. I remembered the last family meeting, just 2 months ago. My grandfather was still alive, sitting at the head of Richard's dining table. I had just closed a $15 million deal with the city of Seattle to renovate 3 historic bridges. Kevin finally managed to do something useful, Richard had announced, raising his glass of wine that cost more than a day's honest work. Of course, I gave him a few tips on how to deal with politicians. "You know how it is, Dad. Without my guidance, he would have ruined everything." People laughed. They applauded. My grandfather just looked at me with those tired, wise eyes and nodded imperceptibly. I had spent 3 months negotiating that contract. 3 months analyzing structural specifications, coordinating with historical engineers, navigating preservation committees and environmental regulations. Richard didn't even know where the bridges were. "Kevin has always been a bit socially awkward," Aunt Margaret used to say at family gatherings, with that tone of feigned pity that hurt more than any direct insult. "That's why he prefers to stay on construction sites rather than at actual networking events." What she didn't know was that I spent 18 hours a day on those sites because someone had to make sure the foundations were right, the materials were quality, our deadlines were met. Meanwhile, he posted photos on Instagram of dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, always tagging the location with hashtags like successful entrepreneur and family legacy. "Mr. Morrison," Richard was practically begging now, her composure completely shattered. "There must be a way to contest this. A mental competency test, perhaps? My father was old when he signed those documents." "Your father was 63 at the time of the transfer," the lawyer replied with infinite patience. "Completely lucid, as assessed by 3 independent doctors at his own request. He wanted to ensure there would be no legal issues later on." My grandfather had thought of everything. Of course he had. The man who built a company from scratch would leave nothing to chance. I remembered the conversation we had 6 years ago, on the day of the transfer. We were in his office, the same one where I had spent countless hours learning about cost estimates and feasibility analysis. Kevin, he had said, her calloused hands holding the documents that would change her life. Have you ever wondered why I keep letting Richard think he'll inherit the company? To protect him? I had replied, still naive enough to believe there was kindness behind his uncle's actions. My grandfather shook his head slowly. To protect the company. Richard is like a peacock. Beautiful on the outside, but with no real substance. As long as he thinks he's already won, he doesn't interfere with the real work. But you, Kevin, you have something that can't be taught. You have integrity. Integrity. The word echoed in my mind as I watched Richard crumble in the lawyer's office. This can't be happening, Richard muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I had it all planned out. I already had interested buyers. I was going to modernize, cut unnecessary costs. My ears pricked up. Buyers. Richard froze, realizing too late that he had revealed something that should have remained a secret. What buyers, Richard? My voice came out colder than I intended. Mrs. Morrison also seemed interested, leaning slightly forward in her chair. Nothing, Richard tried to recover. Just preliminary talks. Market research. It's what any competent executive would do. Executive, I repeated the word slowly. You were planning to sell my grandfather's company. It wasn't a question. The truth was written in every tense line of Richard's face. It was the right strategic move, he defended, regaining some of her previous arrogance. Chen and Associates is stagnant. It needs new capital, a modern vision. I had interested parties willing to pay $50 million. $50 million. The company my grandfather built with his own hands, which employed 120 families, which had a reputation for excellence built over 4 decades. Richard was willing to sell it as if it were just another asset in his portfolio. What about the employees? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. The people who have worked for us for decades. Richard shrugged. Restructuring is normal in mergers and acquisitions. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Aunt Margaret put her hand on her son's shoulder. Richard was just trying to maximize the value of the family inheritance. There's no crime in that. No, I agreed, rising slowly. There's no crime in planning to sell something. But there is a crime in selling something that doesn't belong to you. Reality finally seemed to hit Richard with full force. He wasn't the owner. He never had been. 6 years of planning, of secret negotiations, of promises made to potential buyers. All based on a lie he believed to be true. You can't do this, he said, and for the first time, I heard genuine fear in her voice. The company belongs to the family. You can't just cut her out. I didn't exclude you, Richard, I replied, and allowed a small smile to touch my lips. You were never included to begin with. You just assumed you were. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat again. If I may, there are a few more provisions of the will that need to be read, specifically regarding his personal property. Richard sat back down, looking like a puppet with its strings cut. His perfect world, where he was the golden heir destined for greatness, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. But what none of them knew, as Mr. Morrison prepared to read the next clauses, was that the revelation about the company's ownership was only the beginning. My grandfather hadn't just given me Chen and Associates. He had given me something far more precious. He had given me the complete truth about what Richard had been doing in the shadows. And that truth was about to turn Richard's humiliation into something far, far worse. 50 million, I repeated, letting the number echo around the room. You were willing to sell my grandfather's 40 years of work for $50 million. Richard regained some of his composure, straightening in his chair as if he were still in control. It was a generous offer. Titan Construction Group was willing to pay a significant premium for our client portfolio and reputation. Titan Construction Group. The name hit me like a bomb in my stomach. They were known in Seattle for buying smaller companies, laying off 80% of the employees, and sucking every penny of value out of them before discarding them as empty shells. When? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. What do you mean, when? When did you negotiate with Titan? When did you plan to sell the company that wasn't even his? Mr. Morrison was watching our exchange with growing interest, his fingers drumming softly on the table. Richard hesitated, realizing too late that he was revealing information that could compromise him. That doesn't matter now. The point is, I was trying to maximize the value. 3 weeks ago, Derek's voice suddenly interrupted. My cousin was pale, staring at his phone. There's a notification here in the family WhatsApp group. Richard sent confidentiality agreements for everyone to sign. My mind processed the information quickly. 3 weeks. My grandfather had died 3 weeks and 2 days ago. You negotiated the sale of the company before the funeral even took place, I said, feeling something cold settle in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Aunt Margaret looked shocked, his hand going to his mouth in a gesture of barely concealed horror. It was necessary to act quickly, Richard tried to justify himself, but his voice lost strength. Market opportunities don't wait. Your father's body was still in the morgue, her voice came out louder than she intended, and you were closing deals to sell his legacy. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Chun, I must inform you that any attempt to sell property that does not legally belong to you constitutes fraud. If you have indeed signed any documents or made any contractual promises on behalf of Chen and Associates. I didn't know. Richard practically shouted. How could I have known that the old man had transferred everything without telling me? The old man. He referred to our grandfather, the man who built everything from scratch, as the old man. As if he were just an inconvenient obstacle in his grand plans. Something inside me broke at that moment. It wasn't anger exactly. It was clarity. Absolute, crystal clear clarity about who Richard really was and always had been. You knew, I said calmly. Maybe not consciously, but deep down, you always knew you didn't deserve that company. Richard turned red. I'm the firstborn. I have an MBA. You have a piece of paper that cost my grandfather $60,000 and 5 years of her patience, I interrupted. Meanwhile, I was learning the real business. In the basement, as you yourself mentioned. With the old tools. Those same tools you thought were useless were used to teach construction fundamentals to interns. I remembered the afternoons in the basement of the company headquarters. My grandfather, with her calloused hands, showing me how each tool had a specific purpose. How a poorly laid foundation could compromise an entire building, no matter how beautiful the facade. Do you think running a construction company is about dinners with clients and playing golf? I continued. It's about understanding structural stress, concrete curing schedules, safety regulations that change every year. It's about knowing each of the 120 employees by name, knowing when someone's wife is sick or when someone else's son got into college. That's a manager's job, Richard retorted dismissively. The CEO needs to have strategic vision, not worry about operational details. Strategic vision, I repeated, feeling a cold anger rising. Her strategic vision was to sell to Titan, which has a reputation for destroying family businesses. Her strategy was to fire people who have worked with us for decades. Her grand masterstroke was to turn 40 years of hard work into a fat check for her to spend on more trips to the Caribbean. Derek was typing frantically on his phone. Titan's proposal, he said, her voice shaking, included relocating operations to Phoenix, closing the Seattle facility, laying off 95% of the current staff. 95%. Almost everyone would lose their jobs. Mr. Martinez, who had been with us since the 90s. Ms. Chun, no relation to us, just a coincidence of surnames, who had coordinated our logistics for 20 years. Tom, our most experienced foreman, who was 3 years away from retirement. They would have severance packages, Richard tried to downplay, but her voice was weak. Severance packages that wouldn't make up for decades of loyalty, I replied. They wouldn't replace destroyed communities, displaced families, shattered lives. Mr. Morrison took some notes. Mr. Kevin, there are a few more clauses in the will that need to be read. Specifically related to protections. Protections. The word hung in the air like a promise. His grandfather, the lawyer continued, pulling out another document, was aware of certain tendencies in some family members. He inserted specific clauses to protect both the company and his legacy. Richard paled again. What kind of clauses? Well, Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses, There is a provision stating that any family member who attempts to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of company assets without the approval of the legal owner will be permanently excluded from any future share in the profits or ownership. But I didn't know Kevin was his owner. Ignorance is no legal defense, the lawyer replied softly. Especially when documents were signed without due diligence. I watched my uncle crumble, each layer of arrogance peeling away to reveal the emptiness beneath. But then something changed in his eyes. A spark of desperation that quickly turned to anger. You, he pointed at me, her voice full of venom. You planned all of this. You manipulated Dad, made him think you were better than me. You probably filled her head with lies about my negotiations. I didn't have to do anything, I replied calmly. You did it all yourself, Richard. Every trip you took while I was working. Every time you took credit for my work. Every meeting you missed because you were too busy maintaining your tan. Aunt Margaret stood up abruptly. I'm not going to stand here and listen to my son being insulted by someone who basically stole her inheritance. Inheritance, the word came out of my mouth laden with irony. Richard never inherited anything because he never owned anything. I didn't steal it. I earned it. There's a fundamental difference that you seem incapable of understanding. I'm suing, Richard declared, standing up. I'll prove there was coercion, that Dad wasn't in his right mind. His father, Mr. Morrison interrupted firmly, underwent 3 independent medical evaluations specifically to prevent this type of challenge. There are videos of his explaining his reasons, witness statements, extensive documentation. Any attempt to contest the transfer of ownership will be not only futile, but extremely costly. That's when Derek, who had remained silent, typing on his phone, let out a groan. Dad. Titan is suing us. Richard snatched the phone from his son's hand. His face turned from red to green as he read. They're alleging breach of contract, Derek explained, her voice trembling. Saying you forged property documents and induced them into a fraudulent agreement. They're seeking $15 million in damages. $15 million. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for my uncle. Almost. That's impossible, Richard whispered, the phone shaking in his hands. I didn't sign anything definitive. It was just preliminary talks. There are emails, Derek continued, still looking at his own phone. They've attached them to the lawsuit. You promised them exclusive access to our contracts with the city, assured them he had full authority to sell, even gave them confidential information about our clients. Each word was a devastating revelation. Richard hadn't just planned to sell the company. He had leaked trade secrets, compromised client relationships, violated confidentiality agreements. This could destroy Chen and Associates' reputation, I murmured, feeling the weight of the situation. Years of trust building, ruined. Mr. Morrison leaned forward. Fortunately, there is an exemption clause in the will that explicitly separates Richard Chen's actions from Chen and Associates' responsibilities. Her company is protected, Kevin. But Richard. He didn't need to finish. Richard would face this alone. My uncle looked around the room, seeking support that would not come. Aunt Margaret was crying quietly. Derek looked shocked. Even Mr. Morrison's secretary had discreetly left the room. You did this on purpose, Richard accused her, her voice hoarse. You let me hang myself. No, I corrected him. I just didn't stop you from making the choices you've always made. The same choices you've been making for years, putting your interests above everything else, assuming his charm and family name would solve any problem. I remembered the conversation I had with my grandfather 2 days before he died. In his hospital room, with machines beeping softly in the background. Richard is going to try something, he had whispered, her hand holding mine with surprising strength for someone so frail. When I'm gone, he'll try to sell, destroy, profit. Don't let him, Kevin. Protect our real family, the employees, the customers, the community we've built. I promise, I had replied, not fully understanding what was to come. Now, watching Richard fall apart, I realized that my grandfather had seen everything clearly. He knew exactly who his son was. And he had taken steps to protect not only the company, but everyone who depended on her. The meeting is adjourned, Mr. Morrison announced, beginning to pack up his documents. Kevin, I'll need you to come to the office on Monday to sign some additional documents. Richard, I strongly suggest he seek legal counsel. As everyone got up to leave, Richard blocked her at the door. His face was contorted with rage, the mask of civility finally fallen away. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You may have the company now, but I'm going to destroy you. I'll tell everyone you manipulated a dying man. I'll ruin her reputation, her business, everything." I looked into my uncle's eyes and saw not only anger but fear. Fear of losing the status, the money, the identity he had built on lies. "Do whatever you think is necessary," I replied calmly. "But remember, Richard, I've spent 10 years documenting every move, every decision, every contribution. I have records of every time you lied in meetings, every project you nearly ruined, every penny you wasted. If you want a war, I have enough ammunition to bury him so deep that even his expensive lawyers won't be able to find him." What he didn't know, as he stared at me with barely contained hatred, was that the folder I had brought to the reading of the will contained much more than financial records. It contained emails, recordings of conversations, written testimonies from employees, evidence of every little bit of corruption and incompetence he had committed over the years. More importantly, it contained my grandfather's real will, not just the legal document, but a personal letter explaining exactly why he had made each choice. A letter that, if necessary, I would not hesitate to make public. I left Mr. Morrison's office with the Seattle afternoon sun lighting my way. Behind me, I could hear Aunt Margaret comforting Richard, her solutions already beginning to form, lawyers she would hire, strategies she would try, ways to fix this terrible mistake. But as I walked to my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, in stark contrast to Richard's Mercedes, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The battle was just beginning, and Richard, in his desperation, would become much more dangerous. But for the first time in a decade, I wasn't fighting alone. I had the truth on my side, the law protecting me, and something Richard never had, the genuine respect of the people who really mattered. I started the car and drove to the Chen and Associates office. Monday would be my first day as the officially recognized owner. And I had a lot of work ahead of me, not just to protect my grandfather's legacy, but to build something even greater. Something that Richard, with all her arrogance and greed, could never have imagined possible. Monday arrived with the weight of a silent revolution. I entered the Chen and Associates headquarters at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the usual opening time. The building was empty except for the night security guard who greeted me with a familiar wave. "Good morning, Mr. Kevin." In early as always. I smiled and headed for the elevator. As always. Those 2 words summed up a decade of my life. While Richard slept until noon on his trips around the world, I was here, building, protecting, planning. My office on the 5th floor never had the panoramic view of the 8th floor executive suite that Richard considered her. But it had something much more valuable: direct access to the company's central archives. Files that I had meticulously organized over the years. I sat down at my desk and opened the bottom left drawer. Inside, a worn shoebox held 10 years of documentation that Richard never imagined existed. It wasn't just financial records. It was conversations recorded with his permission during strategic planning meetings. Emails that he had sent me ordering questionable actions. Contracts that she had signed without reading, overly confident in her own importance. Each piece of evidence was dated, catalogued, authenticated. I learned early on that in a family that underestimates you, you have to prove everything twice. My phone vibrated. A message from Derek: "Dad hired Thompson and Associates. They're going to sue for fraud and elder abuse. Sorry, Kevin." Thompson and Associates. Seattle's largest corporate law firm, specializing in inheritance disputes. Richard was moving his pieces quickly, using the money he still had, probably what was left after paying off his inflated credit cards. I replied to Derek, "No problem. I was expecting this." And I was. Mr. Morrison had prepared me for every possible move. But Richard didn't know he had something he could never buy: the truth, fully documented. I called our operations manager, Helen Martinez. She had been answering the phone at 6:30 a.m. for 20 years. "Helen, we need a meeting with all the leadership. Today, 3 p.m. I've heard the rumors, Kevin," his voice was cautious, "about you being the real owner. Is it true?" "Yes. And I need everyone to know the truth before Richard tries a desperate move." I spent the next few hours preparing a presentation that would not only explain my ownership, but reveal every lie Richard had told about his contribution to the company. Every project he claimed to have won, but which I had actually negotiated. Every strategic decision, that was simply him approving my work. At noon my lawyer, James Park, arrived with news. Richard is claiming that his grandfather was senile when he transferred the company. He has 3 witnesses ready to confirm it. I smiled for the first time that day. Show them the videos. My grandfather had recorded 6 different videos, on different dates, with different doctors present, explaining exactly why he was transferring the company to me. Each video showed a lucid, articulate man detailing years of observation about who really kept Chen and Associates running. This will destroy his case, James confirmed. But I didn't just want to win in court. I wanted the truth to be known. I wanted every client, every employee, every person Richard had deceived to know who he really was. And I had just the plan for that. As I prepared the final documents for the afternoon meeting, I looked out the window at the city his grandfather had helped build. Bridge by bridge, building by building, solid foundation by solid foundation. If you've been following this journey of justice and want to see how an underestimated man turned years of humiliation into absolute victory, consider subscribing to the channel, because what comes next will completely redefine the meaning of well-executed revenge. Richard thought this would be a battle over money and property. But while he hired expensive lawyers and prepared empty lawsuits, I was about to do something much more devastating. I was going to tell the truth. All of her. Publicly. And the truth, I discovered over those years of documenting every lie his, was a weapon far more powerful than any lawsuit. The clock struck 3 as the conference room filled up. 23 department heads, all looking at me with curiosity and apprehension. On the monitor, I prepared the first piece of evidence of what had really happened over the past 10 years. Richard had no idea what he was about to face. But soon, everyone would know. The conference room was packed when I began my presentation. 23 faces watched me with curiosity as the first slide appeared on the screen, a photo of me at age 22, on my first day at work, standing next to his grandfather. This is the true story of Chen and Associates, I began. I showed every project that Richard claimed to have won. Then I revealed the emails where I did the actual negotiations. Contracts he signed without reading. Meetings where he arrived late, or didn't show up at all, while I saved million-dollar deals. Helen Martinez was the first to speak, so when Richard said he got the city contract, it was me. I spent 3 months negotiating with 7 different committees. Tom, our foreman, slammed his fist on the table. What about Titan Construction? Were they going to fire everyone? 95%, I confirmed. Richard had already leaked our trade secrets in exchange for $15 million personally. The room erupted in indignant murmurs. I pulled out another document, Richard's conversations with Titan executives, discussing how to cut the fat from the company. There was the name of every employee marked for dismissal. That's when his cell phone rang. It was Derek, breathless. Kevin, my dad is on his way over. He's furious. He says he's going to expose her lies in front of everyone. Let him come, I replied, hanging up. I didn't have to wait long. The doors flew open and Richard burst into the room, flanked by 2 lawyers in dark suits. This meeting is over, he shouted, his face red. This man is lying. He manipulated my father, forged documents. Richard, I interrupted calmly, his lawyers should have advised him better. Breaking into a private meeting of a company that isn't hers. It's not her, he yelled. It's mine. It's always been mine. I clicked the remote control. On the big screen, my grandfather appeared on video, sitting in her favorite chair. If you're watching this, his voice filled the room, it means Richard has finally discovered the truth. I watched my uncle turn pale as the video continued. I transferred the company to Kevin 6 years ago because he's the one who really built it. Richard never worked a day in his life. He is my son, and I love him. But love doesn't mean letting he destroy everything we've built. The next words were devastating. I also discovered that Richard planned to sell the company immediately after my death. I found the emails, the conversations with buyers. He was willing to destroy 120 families for money. Richard staggered, leaning against the wall. One of the lawyers was already putting away his documents, clearly realizing there was no case. This isn't over, Richard whispered, but her voice had lost all strength. I'm going to. Go what? I asked, standing up. Sue? His lawyers already know there's no case. Threaten? I have 10 years of documented evidence. Ruin her reputation? The very people you plan to fire are in this room, listening to every word. I pulled out the last document. Oh, and about Titan? He withdrew his lawsuit this morning. In exchange, I agreed to provide certain information about her unethical business practices. Information you so generously shared with me. Richard's face went from red to white. You wouldn't do that. I already have. The Department of Justice is very interested in bid rigging schemes. His lawyers practically ran out of the room. Richard remained there alone, facing 23 pairs of eyes that now saw him for exactly who he was. Chen and Associates will continue, I announced to the room. Everyone keeps his job. In fact, there will be raises. Because unlike some people, I understand that a company is made up of people, not numbers on a spreadsheet. The applause started slowly, then grew. Helen was crying. Tom was smiling from ear to ear. Richard left silently, a broken man, her life built on lies finally crumbling around him. But as I closed the door behind him, I felt no triumph. I felt only deep relief. The truth was finally free. And the truth, I discovered, was the most powerful revenge of all. 6 months after the meeting that changed everything, I stood atop the new Chen and Associates building, watching Seattle stretch out below. The 80-story building I had personally designed would open the following week, the city's largest green project. Helen Martinez rushed in. Kevin, you need to see this. On the screen, Richard was being interviewed on a local program about corporate fraud. He looked 10 years older, his hair gray, his face thin. How did you get into this situation? The reporter asked. Privilege, Richard replied, his voice weary. He spent his life thinking he deserved everything just because he existed. He never learned how to really work. The interview was part of his agreement with the Department of Justice. In exchange for not facing criminal charges, Richard worked 50 hours a week in homeless shelters and participated in educational programs on ethics, he being the example of what not to do. That's poetic justice, Tom commented. Derek appeared at the door, hesitant. In recent months, my cousin had started working with us, not in an executive position, but as an assistant, learning the business from scratch. Kevin, someone's here to see you. Aunt Margaret entered, visibly uncomfortable. She had lost weight, and her expensive clothes couldn't hide the shame she carried. I came to apologize. For years, I treated you as if you were invisible. I was wrong. And Richard? I asked. He's living with me. He lost everything. But for the first time, he's really working. And you know what's strange? I think he's happier now than when he had everything. Derek showed me pictures of Richard serving food at the shelter, genuinely smiling as he talked to the residents. A spark of humanity I had never noticed before. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find out who we really are, her said. Later, I called a meeting with all 120 employees. I want to tell you a story about a 22-year-old who believed that hard work would be enough. He was partly right. I told them about years of humiliation, sleepless nights, projects I saved while others took credit. But also about his grandfather, who saw everything and paved the way for justice. His grandfather taught me that a company is not just numbers. It's people, families, dreams. That's why today I'm announcing a profit-sharing program. 30% will be divided equally among everyone. The room erupted in applause. Helen was crying. Tom shouted in celebration. We will also implement comprehensive education, paid college for any employee or his children. Talent should not be wasted due to lack of opportunity. The phone rang. It was the governor, wanting to discuss a $200 million contract to rebuild state infrastructure. Projects that Richard could never get because they required real technical knowledge. 3 weeks later, at the building's inauguration, Derek approached with champagne. Dad called yesterday. He said he's proud of you. That grandpa chose right. He said that. He said that 6 months of serving food and listening to real stories taught him more about humanity than 37 years of privilege. He's different, Kevin. Humble. Real. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Perhaps the best revenge wasn't complete destruction, but transformation. Alone in the office, I opened the drawer and took out his grandfather's last letter. Kevin, if you're reading this, the truth has come out. I didn't transfer the company out of anger, but out of love for what we built. You always understood that business is about people, not profits. That a solid foundation is worth more than a beautiful facade. Keep building. And remember, the true legacy is not what we leave behind, but how we treat people. And me? Building something that no money can buy, a legacy based on integrity, not privilege. Helen sent a message, "Boss, Forbes wants to do a story on his life. From shadow to protagonist, how Kevin Chun revolutionized construction." What do you think? Only if we mention every employee by name. The story was never about him, it was always about us. If you've come this far on this journey of transformation, of how quiet work overcame empty privilege, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the best stories are about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I turned off the lights and went home. Not to a mansion bought with inherited money, but to a modest apartment in the historic district I helped revitalize. I didn't need ostentation to prove my worth, the work spoke for itself. Richard tried to bury me, not realizing that seeds don't die in the ground. They grow. Walking through the streets of Seattle, passing buildings we erected, homes we made accessible, workers who could now afford college for their children, I realized something fundamental. The best revenge wasn't destroying Richard. It was building something so big that his arrogance became just a forgotten footnote. 10 years of humiliation turned into decades of impact. Old tools from the basement became the foundations of an empire built on principles. Richard was right about one thing: I was always good at fixing broken things. I just didn't know that the most broken thing I would fix would be the very concept of family legacy. The last I heard, he was starting an ethics consulting firm, using her experiences as examples of what not to do. Humble, hardworking, finally real. As for me, I was just getting started.